You might think men see sex as just a physical act, mechanical, instinct-driven, and devoid of deeper meaning. But that's an illusion. Sex is not just about pleasure, it's about power, about validation, about meaning itself. The way a man experiences intimacy with you determines how he sees himself, how he sees you, and how he sees the relationship that follows or doesn't. Men do not experience sex in a vacuum. It is not merely a physical act, nor is it as emotionally detached as some might assume. Even for the most seemingly indifferent or promiscuous men, sex is intertwined with their psychological and emotional framework. It is a reflection of their inner world, how they view themselves, their status, their worth, and their relationships with others. A man's relationship with sex is often shaped long before he even engages in it. His upbringing, his experiences, his exposure to relationships, and the culture he is surrounded by all play a role in forming his beliefs about intimacy. For some, sex is an act of conquest, a means of proving something to themselves, to their peers, to society. For others, it is an act of deep connection, an affirmation of love, trust, and vulnerability. But even for those who claim to be emotionally disconnected from it, the psychological weight of sex is undeniable. There is an illusion that men can separate sex from emotion entirely. While it is true that men can sometimes compartmentalize their feelings more effectively than women, this does not mean they are immune to the psychological consequences of intimacy. Every sexual encounter leaves a mark, whether it is a deepening attachment, a growing sense of emptiness, or a shift in self-perception. For many men, sex is validation. It reassures them of their desirability, their status, their ability to attract and be wanted. This is why some men chase it endlessly, moving from one partner to the next, not necessarily for the physical pleasure alone, but for the affirmation that they are significant, desirable, and competent. But the danger here is that when sex becomes merely a tool for validation, it ceases to be fulfilling in the long run. Like any external measure of self-worth, it creates dependency. The more a man seeks validation through sex, the more he requires it, and yet the less satisfying it becomes. On the other hand, when sex carries meaning, when it is tied to genuine connection, emotional security, and mutual respect, it has the power to strengthen a man rather than weaken him. It provides him with a sense of purpose within a relationship, a deeper understanding of his partner, and an opportunity for vulnerability in a world that often discourages men from expressing it. This is why the way men view sex is often a direct reflection of their psychological and emotional health. A man who is secure in himself does not need sex to prove his worth. He does not chase meaningless encounters to fill a void. Instead, he sees intimacy as a sacred exchange, something that enhances his life rather than defines it. But a man who is insecure, lost, or emotionally disconnected will often use sex as a distraction, a temporary relief from his deeper struggles. The way a man approaches sex with you reveals much about him. Does he see it as a means to an end, or as something valuable in itself? Does he respect the emotional weight of intimacy, or does he treat it as something casual and disposable? More importantly, how does it shape his perception of you after the act? Understanding that sex is deeply psychological allows you to see past the surface-level assumptions about male desire. It is not just about the act itself, it is about everything it represents: power, validation, connection, vulnerability, and self-worth. And whether a man realizes it or not, every intimate experience he has carries these unspoken implications, shaping not only his relationships, but also his own identity. Men have an intrinsic relationship with effort and reward. From an early age, they are taught either explicitly or through experience that the things they work for hold the most value. Whether it's achieving success in their careers, excelling in sports, or building a skill, the process of struggle and perseverance creates a deep sense of appreciation for the outcome. This principle extends into their relationships and, most importantly, into how they view sex and intimacy. If something is given freely and without effort, it often fails to command the same level of respect as something that required dedication and patience. This is not about arrogance or manipulation. It is simply a reflection of human nature. Consider the way people treat money if someone is handed a fortune without ever having to work for it. They often spend recklessly, taking it for granted because they never had to endure the discipline and struggle of earning it. Compare that to the person who works tirelessly to build their wealth. They are more likely to respect and protect what they have because they understand its value. The same applies to relationships and sex. When a man has to put in effort, whether through emotional investment, commitment, or time, naturally values the intimacy he receives in return. It signifies something earned, something meaningful, rather than something disposable. This is why relationships built on genuine effort and connection tend to last longer than those based on instant gratification. On the other hand, when sex is obtained too easily, without any real investment, emotional, intellectual, or otherwise, often diminishes its perceived value. It becomes just another experience, another transaction, rather than something deeply meaningful. This is not to suggest that men intentionally devalue intimacy when it is freely given, but rather that human psychology tends to assign greater worth to things that require some level of difficulty or exclusivity. This is evident in how men behave in different types of relationships. A man who has worked to build trust, who has taken time to understand a woman, who has demonstrated patience and commitment, will often see intimacy with her as a significant and treasured experience. But a man who gets what he wants without having to exert any real effort may enjoy the moment, but he is far less likely to attach lasting value to it. It is not because he is cruel or indifferent, it is simply because there was no real challenge involved, no process of earning something meaningful. This also ties into how men view women. If a man perceives that a woman has high standards and does not easily give away her intimacy, he instinctively sees her as someone of higher value. It signals to him that she respects herself, that she is not easily swayed, and that if he wants to be with her, he must prove himself in some way. This creates a dynamic where he sees her as worthy of effort and therefore worthy of long-term respect. On the contrary, if a man believes that a woman gives herself away too quickly, with little to no effort required, his subconscious mind often registers this as a lack of value. He may still engage, he may still pursue, but deep down he recognizes that what was gained so easily could be given just as easily to someone else. This doesn't mean that every man actively thinks this way. It's often an instinctual reaction rather than a conscious decision. This principle explains why some men become deeply devoted to the women they had to work for, while becoming indifferent toward those who made it too easy. The chase, the effort, and the feeling of accomplishment all play into how men form attachments. It's not about playing games or making things difficult for the sake of difficulty. It's about understanding human nature and the role that effort plays in forming deep and meaningful bonds. Respect is not something that can be demanded. It is something that is cultivated through boundaries, standards, and self-worth. Men, by their very nature, are drawn to challenges. They pursue careers, goals, and aspirations that require them to push themselves beyond their limits. They respect discipline, commitment, and things that are rare or difficult to obtain. The same mindset applies to relationships. A woman who understands this dynamic does not see it as manipulation, but rather as a way of ensuring that she is valued for more than just a fleeting moment of pleasure. When a man respects what he earns, it means that he sees value in the effort required to be with someone. He recognizes that what took time, patience, and emotional investment to attain is worth holding on to. And when that respect is present, the foundation for something far more meaningful and lasting is created. The idea that casual sex is entirely neutral, without consequences, without deeper psychological impact, is one of the biggest illusions of modern relationships. The notion that men can engage in repeated, meaningless encounters without any emotional or psychological repercussions is not only misleading, but fundamentally ignores human nature. Sex is not just a physical act. It has a profound impact on the psyche, shaping the way men view themselves, their partners, and their relationships as a whole. For some men, casual sex may seem like an attractive arrangement pleasure without responsibility, intimacy without attachment. In theory, it appears to be a perfect setup. an opportunity to satisfy desires while remaining emotionally unburdened. But beneath the surface, every encounter carries an unspoken weight. Even the most emotionally detached individuals experience shifts in their perceptions, their self-worth, and their expectations as they continue to engage in fleeting, transactional intimacy. One of the most common consequences of casual sex is a loss of respect, not just for the partner, but for oneself. When sex is stripped of meaning and treated as just another experience, it begins to lose its significance. Over time, this can create a sense of emptiness, as the pursuit of pleasure fails to provide deeper fulfillment. A man may chase one partner after another, thinking he is in control of the situation, but eventually he finds himself asking why the excitement fades so quickly, why the satisfaction is so temporary, and why no single encounter truly brings lasting contentment. There is also the issue of detachment. Many men engage in casual sex under the assumption that they can remain unaffected, that they can separate the physical from the emotional, as if intimacy were nothing more than a mechanical interaction. But the reality is that sex has an inherent psychological and biological impact. The release of oxytocin, the subconscious association with bonding, and the unspoken expectations that arise after intimacy all contribute to an internal shift, whether acknowledged or not. The mind and body are wired to form attachments, even in situations where attachment is actively resisted. For some men, this results in an unexpected emotional connection to partners they never intended to bond with. They find themselves drawn back to someone out of habit, confusing lust for attachment, or mistaking temporary pleasure for genuine connection. Others go in the opposite direction, becoming increasingly desensitized to intimacy. They train themselves to detach, to suppress emotional responses, to see their partners as interchangeable rather than significant. Over time, this can lead to a diminished ability to form deep, meaningful relationships, as they have conditioned themselves to view sex as something entirely separate from emotional investment. Another consequence of casual sex is the erosion of trust, not just between partners, but within oneself. When a man engages in multiple fleeting encounters, he may begin to question the sincerity of his own feelings. Are his desires genuine, or are they just reactions to impulse? Is he truly attracted to someone, or is he simply seeking temporary validation? Does he actually care about his partner, or is he just using them for momentary gratification? This internal conflict can create a sense of disconnection, making it difficult to distinguish real emotional depth from surface-level attraction. Moreover, casual sex alters the way men perceive women and relationships as a whole. When sex becomes readily available with minimal effort, it can lead to a diminished appreciation for commitment and stability. If every encounter is easily replaced by another, the incentive to invest in a deeper relationship weakens. A man who engages in casual sex repeatedly may start to see women less as individuals with unique value and more as opportunities for gratification. He may become cynical about relationships, viewing them as unnecessary or burdensome rather than meaningful and enriching. Despite what modern culture promotes, sex is never truly meaningless. Every encounter leaves an imprint in one's emotions, one's sense of self, and one's future relationships. It shapes the way men approach intimacy, the standards they set for themselves, and the expectations they form about love and connection. Some may be able to ignore these effects in the short term, but over time, the truth reveals itself. The pursuit of casual, detached intimacy often leads not to fulfillment, but to an increasing sense of isolation. Understanding that casual sex is not emotionally neutral allows men to make more intentional choices. It forces them to acknowledge that their actions have consequences not just for others, but for themselves. It challenges them to think beyond the immediate gratification and consider the long-term impact of their relationships and interactions. And ultimately, it leads to a deeper awareness of what they truly seek from intimacy, not just in the moment, but for their future well-being. Sex is never just a physical act. It is a social contract, whether people acknowledge it or not. Every intimate encounter comes with unspoken expectations, obligations, and consequences that extend beyond the moment itself. Despite modern attempts to frame sex as a purely casual or consequence-free interaction, human nature resists this notion. The reality is that sex carries meaning, and with meaning comes responsibility both to oneself and to the other person involved. At its core, sex is an exchange not just of physical pleasure, but of emotional energy, vulnerability, and unspoken agreements. These agreements vary depending on the individuals, their expectations, and the context of their relationship, but they are always present. In some cases, the contract is based on mutual respect and commitment, where both partners recognize that intimacy strengthens their bond and creates deeper emotional attachment. In other cases, the contract is more ambiguous. One person may see the encounter as a step toward a relationship, while the other views it as a temporary indulgence. When these expectations are not aligned, tension arises, leading to misunderstandings, resentment, and emotional fallout. Men instinctively recognize that sex shifts the dynamics between two people. Even in the most casual situations, there is an implicit understanding that intimacy changes things. It creates a connection, whether fleeting or lasting, and with connection comes responsibility. A man may not consciously articulate this, but he feels it, whether it's a sense of obligation, an awareness of new expectations, or a change in how he perceives his partner. The moment sex occurs, an unspoken agreement has been formed, one that cannot simply be erased by claiming that it meant nothing. This is why men often react differently toward women after sex. Sometimes the shift is positive, feels closer, more protective, more invested. Other times the shift is negative, he feels trapped, guilty, or disinterested. But in almost every case, something changes. The social contract has been activated, and whether acknowledged or ignored, its influence lingers. One of the most overlooked aspects of this social contract is the emotional weight that sex carries. Even in situations where both parties claim they are engaging without expectations, the reality is that most people, men and women alike, form at least some degree of attachment. The chemicals released during intimacy, particularly oxytocin, foster feelings of bonding and trust. This is part of the biological wiring of human beings. Sex was never designed to be purely transactional. It was meant to serve as a means of deepening relationships, securing bonds, and ensuring the continuation of the species. When people ignore this reality and attempt to engage in sex without acknowledging its inherent social contract, they create a form of internal dissonance. A man who repeatedly tells himself that sex is meaningless, that it carries no expectations or consequences, will eventually find himself at odds with his own emotions. He may feel guilt without understanding why, detachment without realizing the cause, or an inexplicable sense of dissatisfaction despite engaging in what should, in theory, be pleasurable experiences. Moreover, the unspoken social contract of sex extends beyond the individuals involved. It affects society as a whole. When sex is treated as disposable, relationships suffer. Men and women alike become more cynical, trust diminishes, and the ability to form meaningful long-term bonds weakens. The normalization of casual intimacy without responsibility leads to an erosion of commitment, as people become conditioned to view relationships through a lens of instant gratification rather than investment and sacrifice. At a fundamental level, human beings crave structure and meaning. When sex occurs within the framework of a clear and mutually respected agreement, whether that is a committed relationship, a marriage, or an explicitly understood partnership, it fosters stability and trust. But when sex happens in a way that disregards its implicit social contract, it creates confusion, insecurity, and emotional turbulence. For men, understanding that sex carries an unspoken social contract is crucial in navigating relationships with integrity. It requires an awareness of how their actions impact not just their partners, but their own psychological and emotional well-being. It means recognizing that every encounter leaves an imprint in their perceptions of intimacy, their ability to bond, and their overall sense of fulfillment. Sex is never just about the moment. It extends into the future, shaping expectations, behaviors, and relationships in ways that are often only realized long after the act itself. Ignoring the unspoken social contract does not eliminate its presence, it only ensures that its consequences unfold in unpredictable and often damaging ways. Understanding this reality allows men to engage with intimacy more consciously, with a greater sense of responsibility, and with a deeper appreciation for the true significance of sex in their lives. Women play an essential role in shaping the nature of intimacy, whether consciously or not. They determine the standards, set the boundaries, and ultimately decide the level of emotional depth that a relationship will reach. Men may pursue, initiate, and even attempt to define the terms of intimacy, but women are the gatekeepers of its meaning. This is not a matter of control in a manipulative sense, but rather a reflection of how human dynamics work. Throughout history and across cultures, it has been understood that women hold the keys to meaningful intimacy, and the way they wield this influence has a profound impact on relationships, family structures, and society as a whole. Sex and intimacy are not just biological functions. They are deeply tied to emotional connection, commitment, and the structure of relationships. While men and women both experience the effects of intimacy, women generally place a higher intrinsic value on it. They tend to associate sex with bonding, trust, and security, whereas men, while still affected by these factors, can sometimes separate the physical from the emotional more easily. However, when women set the tone for meaningful intimacy, when they make it clear that sex is not merely an act but a reflection of commitment and emotional investment, men are naturally inclined to rise to that standard. A woman's ability to establish boundaries and expectations in intimacy dictates the level of respect she receives. When a woman values herself and demands emotional investment before engaging in sex, she signals to men that she is not disposable, that intimacy with her carries weight, and that it is not something to be taken lightly. This in turn causes men to view her as someone worth investing in, someone whose presence in their lives holds meaning beyond just physical gratification. Conversely, when a woman allows sex to occur too easily, without requiring effort, respect, or emotional connection, she inadvertently diminishes its perceived value. This does not mean that a woman should play games or make intimacy artificially difficult to obtain. Rather, it means that she must recognize that the way she approaches sex directly affects the way she is perceived. Men instinctively respect what they have to earn. They appreciate what is rare and what requires effort. This is why men often cherish relationships in which they had to prove themselves, where they had to demonstrate their worth, and where intimacy was a reward for genuine connection rather than something freely given without any real expectation. This principle extends beyond just individual relationships. It influences societal norms as a whole. When women collectively uphold higher standards for intimacy, men are naturally pushed to evolve, to become more responsible, more committed, and more emotionally aware. They understand that if they wish to engage in meaningful intimacy, they must first cultivate meaningful qualities within themselves. However, when the culture shifts to one where sex is readily available without any real effort, men are given little incentive to develop the traits that make them worthy of deep connection. Women have always shaped the course of relationships through the expectations they set. A woman who understands her value does not seek validation through sex alone. She recognizes that her worth is not defined by how easily she is desired, but by the depth of the connection she is willing to foster. She knows that real intimacy is not just about physical closeness, but about emotional security, trust, and long-term commitment. When a woman holds the keys to meaningful intimacy, she creates a dynamic where a man must prove his intentions. This does not mean demanding perfection or creating impossible hurdles, but rather ensuring that intimacy is built on a foundation of respect and mutual understanding. A man who truly values a woman will have no problem investing in her emotionally before expecting physical closeness. In contrast, A man who only seeks gratification without investment is unlikely to stay for anything deeper, and when intimacy is given too easily, he has no reason to develop a genuine attachment. The truth is, men crave meaningful intimacy just as much as women, even if they do not always express it in the same way. A relationship built on depth, emotional security, and mutual growth is ultimately more fulfilling than one based solely on momentary pleasure. But in order for men to recognize this and rise to that level, women must first establish the expectation that intimacy is something of value, something that requires emotional engagement and commitment. Women have the ability to elevate relationships, to inspire men to become better versions of themselves, and to foster deeper connections by setting the standard for meaningful intimacy. When this power is used wisely, it leads to stronger relationships, greater respect, and a more fulfilling experience of love and companionship. But when it is disregarded, when sex is treated as something casual, disconnected, and without value, it leads to detachment, dissatisfaction, and an overall weakening of emotional bonds. Ultimately, the key to meaningful intimacy lies in recognizing that sex is not just an act, but an expression of something deeper. Women, by holding the keys to this depth, have the ability to shape not only their own relationships, but the way men engage with intimacy as a whole. By valuing themselves and their standards, they encourage men to do the same, creating a dynamic where love, trust, and connection flourish beyond just the physical.